think we should talk about it. Diving deep, let it go, see you want it.
Hello everyone. Welcome to Let's Talk About It. Let's Talk About It is a safe space where we break down stigmas and assumptions and we educate on important topics surrounding neurodiversity, mental health and all of our differences. I am your host, Isabella, and each episode I will be joined by a magic words therapist and also a special guest, both of which will be connected to the episode's topic. So, without further ado, we are so excited to introduce you to our first guest, Ellie Middleton. Now, if you have LinkedIn, I'm sure you'll already know about Ellie, but if you don't, Ellie is an absolute powerhouse. She's a huge voice in the neurodiversity space and is also a personal brand manager at Great Influence. With a combined social media following of over 60,000, Ellie uses her platform to speak candidly about her own experiences as a woman with late diagnosed ADHD and autism. She encourages people to celebrate their differences and offers guidance to employers on how best to support their neurodivergent team members. Hello, Ellie. Thank you so much for joining us today.
So much for having me, and thank you for that lovely introduction.
You're welcome. I'm also over the moon to introduce our Magic Words therapist today, the lovely Laura Maslin. Laura is a Magic Words therapist and one of our Empower Autism specialists. Laura has been with us just over a year now and has a range of experience and knowledge about autism. Hello, Laura.
Hi.
Okay, so Ellie, we know that you received your diagnosis once you were in adulthood. I'd really love to know just a bit more about your experience around your autism diagnosis and what led you up to the point where you kind of thought that that was something that may be affecting you or was something that was connected to you in some way.
Yeah, so it kind of came out of nowhere really over the past year, definitely. But yeah, in the past, I have had quite a long journey with my mental health. So I've always really struggled. Kind of when it came to a peak when I was 15, I was diagnosed with anxiety, like generalized anxiety disorder and depression. So I was with the children and adolescents mental health team, was mostly having kind of like panic attacks, lots of anxiety, lots of overwhelm and stuff like that. And yeah, I was kind of told that anxiety was the cause of the problem. And kind of from there kept going in like cycles almost, I guess, of being in this kind of really low place and really overwhelmed and really kind of lost and upset to kind of going back into being the, kind of like digging myself out of the hole and going back to being like the person I am now, like quite busy and quite, always wanting to do everything and quite ambitious and quite like high flying, I guess. And then again, every like 6 months or so, I'd kind of like crash and burn and go back to that really low place. So yeah, I'd kind of always just been diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, depression. They'd kind of thrown agoraphobia and panic disorder into the mix at one point as well. And kind of, I was getting really overwhelmed to the point where I just didn't want to leave the house. But yeah, that was kind of the only answers that I'd ever been given. And this cycle kind of kept happening. And about this time last year, when we were in the third lockdown, just after Christmas, I could kind of like feel the cycle happening again. Like I could feel myself like getting back to that low point and getting back to feeling really overwhelmed. And I was just kind of like, I'm not doing it again. I couldn't work out why. Like I'm doing all the right things. I'm getting myself out of that dark place. I'm having my antidepressants. I'm seeing a counsellor. I'm looking after myself. Like I'm doing all this self-care journaling. Like I'm doing everything that I'm supposed to do. Why am I going back into this hole every like 6 months, year? And I was kind of like thinking a lot about it at the time, like kind of realizing that anxiety wasn't the problem. It was like the side effect of whatever else was going on, because 90% of the time I wasn't anxious. Like, I don't worry about things that most people worry about. I'm not scared of heights. I'm not scared of flying. I don't mind going away on my own. I'm quite sociable. I don't mind talking to people or getting up on stage. I was like, I'm not anxious. I'm just getting to a point where I'm like so burnt out and overwhelmed that then I go into this like massive anxious hole. And at first, I guess I'd kind of been doing like a lot of Googling and a lot of like thinking like what is going on here. And I kind of firstly thought it was something more to do with like BPD or bipolar or something like that, just because of like the extremes of the way that I was feeling, going from being this kind of really happy, bubbly person to this like person, like shell of a person that was just like so upset and so overwhelmed and stuff. And I think that was kind of the only thing that I'd ever been aware of that might explain those things. And that was kind of the first rabbit hole that I went down. But at the same time, I was seeing a counsellor through work, and we were talking about something. I'd had like an argument with my ex-boyfriend, and we were kind of like working out like why that thing had bothered me. And she asked me the question, has it ever been looked into why you take things so literally? And I was like, no, but I think I know what you're hinting at here. And like that kind of went again to me, like going back to the rabbit hole, Googling, Instagramming, TikToking, like everything that I could possibly absorb about autism. You know, I was just like, oh my goodness, this explains everything. And then, at that point, managed to talk to someone from the NHS who kind of, ruled out the BPD and bipolar side, and, were saying that didn't really explain what was going on. But they definitely thought that I should, 1, have an assessment for autism, and 2, have an assessment for ADHD. So it was going to be quite a long wait through the NHS. So I decided to get my ADHD diagnosis first, just because I felt like I could kind of, if I was going to go private, I could justify paying for that one more because the medication came off the back of it. So it was like an actual kind of outcome that I couldn't have reached on my own. I needed the doctor to tell me that, and something could come off the back of it, because I was kind of still very aware that this black hole was happening, and it was like, I need an answer now. I need something to happen now to get me out of it, and then I can kind of carry on with the exploration. I got my ADHD diagnosis back in October. So I was 24. It was kind of life-changing for me. And I think actually getting diagnosed with ADHD and treating the ADHD made the autistic traits become even more apparent, because it was like, first of all, I'd started this kind of unmasking process because I'd started to allow myself to be chaotic ADHD Ellie, rather than this kind of mask that I'd been putting on for such a long time. And at the same time as letting chaotic Ellie come out, kind of more of the real Ellie that included all these autistic traits started to come out too. But I think as well, like actually medicating my ADHD, it was almost like, I've seen a few people try and explain it on TikTok, where it's like the ADHD is so like chaotic and loud and noisy in the front and just causing like a storm. And then as soon as you start to kind of medicate that and bring the chaos down a bit, it's like the autism's hiding behind like, hello, it's my time to shine. I think kind of before my ADHD diagnosis, I was still kind of looking, like considering the fact that I might be autistic. But I think definitely kind of in the space between ADHD diagnosis and actually getting diagnosed with autism in January, I'd like very much been like, it became even more apparent at that point. I got my diagnosis in January. I got it through like Right to Choose with the NHS. So it was with a private provider, but through the NHS. So that was kind of really good. And I think even though I was like, I really wanted that diagnosis by the time that I got it, like I had done all this kind of exploration and I'd already been talking about it so much at that point, and I was already quite comfortable in being self-diagnosed. But the actual assessment and diagnosis itself has definitely brought up a lot of stuff that I'm like kind of still in the process of processing, I think. I think I definitely like didn't consider how much of my life I would look at again after the assessment and kind of digging it all back up again. Overall, I would say that the diagnosis for me has been completely life-changing. Like my life, every single aspect of my life is different to what it was, this time last year when I kind of was re-entering that black hole. So it's been incredible, really.
That's a really powerful story. It's really like powerful to listen to as, I guess, a professional in the field as well. Because when we learn, even just like at uni when we're training, when we learn about autism, it's all focused on boys. And I think it is really interesting that with girls especially, we don't tend to go, autism, we tend to go mental health. And that's exactly what you've just described as well. Even things like when we're doing our autism assessments, they were mainly and largely standardized on boys. So it's like the gold standard for assessment and diagnosing autism just automatically not disregards girls, but it's going to be harder for girls to get those assessments and get those diagnoses because it's just also centered around boys and boys' presentation and all of that sort of stuff. And we do tend to go down mental health first for girls, which is just a whole problem in itself for society, isn't it? But
I think as well, for me, it kind of like, I think about it a lot that I was so lucky in all that support that I had. Like I was with the Children and Adolescents Mental Health Service. Like that in itself is a massive like so many people don't even get to that level of help. You know, I was kind of put on antidepressants at 15, which meant that I was seeing a psychiatrist every second week. I was seeing my key worker, I was seeing the psychologist, and all of that is like a massive privilege to get that level of support. And still not one person ever considered that I might be autistic.
No.
So it's like I was literally kind of in the top 10% of the support, if that, probably the top 5% of like the amount of support that people get, and it still didn't get flagged. So like, what hope of 99% of people that aren't getting all that support got when we're just not looking for it in the same way that we are looking for it in boys?
Totally. Yeah, I completely
think...
agree. And obviously it's your lived experience, isn't it? Sorry, Isabella.
No, it's okay. It does make you think, you know, how many people are who don't maybe have access to these resources and don't have that support, who aren't in those, you know, specific settings. Like, you know, there's quite a lot of schools and things out there where they don't have that kind of mental health support or the counselling side of things or things like that. And you just think how many people are going under the radar here and being missed out and not getting help that they may need. It's very sad.
So, yeah, I think it's, at least anecdotally, this is not a wide scale study, but anecdotally, what I see a lot of in my practice is mums specifically see their child getting an autism diagnosis or going through that process and going, I think I'm autistic, and then kind of following up on it. But no one's ever said it to them or even raised it as a possibility for them until, you know, their young kid, who tends to be a boy, starts getting, you know, all these assessments and all these professionals are going, oh, I'm seeing characteristics here. And then they start to reflect and they go, yeah, I'm seeing characteristics too in myself. So yeah, it's definitely becoming more prevalent that we are aware of the fact that girls and women can be autistic, but we've got a long way to go. Ellie, is it all right if I ask you a follow-up question? I just really wanted to ask about masking. I know we're going to go there later as well. Yeah. Is that okay? So when you said, you know, you're talking about your ADHD symptoms and kind of medicating the ADHD and then the autism going, hi, were you aware when you were masking that you were masking? Or is that something that you've only come to kind of be cognizant of after you've made an effort to unmask, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think it's really kind of like tricky to work out as well, like what was masking and what wasn't. So I think I was definitely aware that I didn't fit in, and I was definitely aware that I changed myself to try and fit in. You know, I was like almost aware of the fact that I was a people pleaser, but I think there was a lot of things that I wasn't aware of, like exactly what I was masking. You know, I definitely kind of wasn't aware of all the sensory stuff and like the sensory overload. And yeah, I don't think I was almost aware of what I was masking, but I do think I knew that I wasn't being true to myself. I think, you know, it was more that like I guess I know that I'm not this person who's doing all these things, but not even a kind of aware that everybody else wasn't doing that, if that makes sense as well. It's also maybe everyone else just like makes themselves a nice package because people are like them. Like maybe that's just what everyone does. Yeah. But yeah, I think like a lot of it is definitely looking back and realizing, oh my goodness. And I think like I have changed so much since my diagnosis. Like my parents will say, you know, even my parents who were the people that I will have been like the most myself around, because it's at home, it's not at school, it's not at work, it's not when you feel like you have to pretend. That's like literally in my safe place. Even my parents are like, we have seen such a massive difference in the person that you are. And it's like, yeah, there was so much that was kind of hidden away and covered up and changed. Definitely. I think I was aware that I was a people pleaser more than anything, rather than masking. Yeah. But yeah, I think a lot of it is just looking back on reflection and thinking, yeah, that was who even was that person. I think it can be quite strange as well, because it's like once you've unmasked, you can't put it back up again. You know, like there's stuff that I've done in the past, like, I don't know, gone on like massive nights out and been clubbing and being like this social butterfly, whatever. And I think even if I tried my absolute hardest now, there is just no way I could do that. And I just think I wasn't even aware that I wasn't enjoying doing it. I was just thinking, yeah, this is what I would like. And it's just like, I just could not stick that mask back on now if I tried. But yeah, I find it very interesting to like think about and to work out, I guess, like, right, okay, which parts of that person was me and which parts of that person, like how much of it is natural that I'm growing up and changing, and how much of it is that like I was literally kind of faking who I was as a person. But yeah.
So that being said, Ellie, obviously since having your diagnosis, your life, you know, has changed and people have kind of seen a different side to you and all of these different things. Do you think that if you had had your diagnosis in childhood or, you know, very early on, do you think that you would have preferred that, just knowing about autism, you know, back in childhood? And do you think that your life would have been different had you known and had you had that diagnosis earlier?
Yeah, me and my mum were actually talking about this quite recently. So obviously, like when I first got my diagnosis, there is kind of like this grief process of like, you know, I wouldn't have had all these really awful times where I couldn't have got I couldn't have got myself out of bed. I didn't want to talk to anyone. Like I would have never have got as low as I did, because the lowness wasn't caused by being autistic. It was caused by not understanding that I was autistic and by masking and by being in situations that weren't right for me. And I think like certain stuff that's happened, like for example, I had to drop out of sixth form. I got to a point in the sixth form where I was just so severely anxious that I couldn't leave the house, couldn't go into school. And yeah, I dropped out and declined my uni offers. So stuff like that, I think, is very much like, well, if I'd have known at school, I would have, one, not got to that point where I had to drop out, but two, I would have got the right support to get me through those exams. And I would have, you know, got my degree, I would have got my A-levels, all this stuff. But then my mum kind of came back and said, well, if you'd have been told at that age that you were autistic, you would have run a mile. Like you would have hated that because you were this people pleaser. You were this like masker. If we'd have tried to give you this label that made you different, you would have hated that as a teenager. You know, it's been amazing for you now because you were ready for it and you wanted those answers. But like knowing how kind of anxious and how concerned you were with how everyone around you considered you, I don't think you'd have wanted to know. And we've kind of thought about that for a while. And I think I said to my mum, I think if it had been before a certain point, then I would have wanted to know, because I never would have got to the point of being that kind of teenage Ellie that was so obsessed with pleasing everyone around them. You know, I think if I'd have known maybe primary school age or up to kind of like year 7, I would have kind of, I think I would have been kind of unmasked right from that point. But I think for me, I've kind of identified that the time when I started like really masking and really losing myself was like kind of that 13, 14, year 8, year 9, where everyone is kind of going through that, you know, becoming a teenager stage. But I was just like a different person overnight. And I think, if I'd have found out before that point, then I think I would have, you know, that would have been amazing. But I do think by the time I'd got to that masking, it still would have been life-changing, and it still would have set me up for like having the support that I needed. But I don't think I would have received it as well as I have done now. I think there would have been pushback from me that I didn't want anyone to know, and I didn't want a label, and it must be wrong, and I'm not that person. But I think as well that's kind of to do with the change in ideas of autism as well. You know, at that point, I would have definitely had like negative ideas of what autism was, whereas now I was kind of like, I'm quite happy with that label because I know what it means as a whole.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I imagine, like, even in my experience, like back when, because me and you were a very similar age, Ellie, and at the, like, when I think back to, you know, primary school, secondary school, I didn't know what autism was. And I think you have this kind of perception about what autism is and what kind of person an autistic person is. And there's not really that much education around it, especially not in school. Like at the time, we were never kind of taught about neurodiversity. We were never taught about, you know, different people and all these things. So I think it's harder to think back to a time then when it wasn't, let's say, as accepted or as known about than it is now. So it's really hard to kind of place yourself back in that time when you're like, well, the way that you would say I'm autistic then and to compare it to when you would say to someone I'm autistic now would be, I think, different reactions.
Yeah, I definitely think that's the case as well. And I think as well, like, if I think back to that time when I was kind of like 14, 15, when I got diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, even that was like a massive thing at that point. Like mental health was still very stigmatized at that point. It was still very like you know, I had quite a rough time with people calling me an attention seeker because I needed to leave the classroom. Like I had a really rough time even with the mental health stigma. And I think if you think of how far that's come in 10 years with like mental health is so normalized now, like it's so acceptable to be anxious or depressed. And I think, you know, yeah, if the mental health side has come that far, then I think almost like the neurodiversity side is like maybe another 10 years behind that almost, by hopefully, you know, we'll start to see that becoming just as normalized. But it was probably even further behind the stigma that I experienced just for, you know, being anxious. If I'd have actually had it, you know, yeah, the level further of autism that no one really understood, yeah, I think it would have been a very different experience to what, like, the place that we're in now.
I wonder if there might also have been like an added complication of, as you say, you were, you know, a people pleaser, and you were masking all these traits. And I wonder if there almost would have been a sense like amongst other people of like, well, she's not autistic. Do you know what I mean? Because partly because you're a girl, but also partly because of everything you were doing to try and maybe like appear less autistic, even though you didn't know that's what you were doing at the time, which just makes it like infinitely harder, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And I think now I'm at a point, like when I've got it over this last year, I was at a point where I was completely ready to accept it. You know, I think the fact that I wanted, like I went on the hunt for those answers, not that it should be that way, you know, people deserve to have it picked up like themselves. But I think the fact that I was like actively on a search for like, okay, what is going on in my brain? Why am I feeling this way? Why is this happening? It's almost like I was ready to get that answer because I was looking for it. Whereas if it had just been like this label stuck on me, then I probably wouldn't have accepted it or like let myself unmask in the way that I have now. I would have probably, you know, like resisted it, pushed it back. No, not happening. Like that's not me. And yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about. Half of me is like, you know, I think for somebody else, I would definitely want them to know from a young age, because it's like, I know that you wouldn't get to those low points that I have had if you'd have had the support. You know, like looking at it from an outside point of view, I don't think, you know, like don't diagnose teenage girls because they'll hate it. Like that's definitely not what I'm saying. I just think I know from the person that I was at that time, how anxious I had got, how concerned I was with pleasing the people around me, that I personally probably wouldn't have taken it as well as I have done now.
Well, it's absolutely amazing how you've just taken this, you know, diagnosis that you've got and you've, like you say, your life's completely changed and you've kind of gone down this route on LinkedIn and you're educating people and it's just spiraled. Like you talk a lot about neurodiversity, you talk a lot about mental health, you talk about your own experiences, and you've obviously inspired a lot of people I've seen, you know, all over, where people are inspired to go and get a diagnosis or go and speak to someone and see, like, you know, and it's just come from you and they've gone, oh, actually, something that Ellie said has kind of resonated with me here and I'm going to explore that. And I just think that's absolutely incredible that you've taken this thing and you've just kind of turned it into this really positive space that you've got. And that has in turn turned into, you know, you're educating your audience and you're also educating businesses now, all about neurodivergence in the workplace. And this is something we find super interesting and we'd just love to know, what would you say, just from your experience in the different businesses and things that you've spoken to, what would you say most places or most businesses get wrong in terms of their neurodivergent employees?
Yeah, I think it's all just down to kind of like the understanding education, like whether it's businesses or people. I think everybody, like just the vast majority of society, just don't understand what it actually is and what it actually, you know, consists of and means and like is like to live with. And I think I was like very much in that, literally until a year ago, I was very much in that camp. Like, I think we all have this like old idea, you know, if someone would have said to me, what is autistic? And I think this is kind of like a similar thing to what most people think. I would have thought of kind of Sheldon Cooper, Rain Man, like again, definitely a man, definitely someone that was like really socially awkward, someone that was like difficult to be around, a bit of a genius. Like I would have thought that too. So it's like, I don't blame you for thinking that, because that's all we're taught and told up until this point. That's kind of all we've known. And I think as soon as you kind of talk to people and you explain that, okay, that's not just what it looks like. It might look like that, but it might look like me, or it might look like the person that you're working with, or it might look like, you know, someone that's a bit shy, or it might look like someone that you think's a bit, you know, too blunt. That might be because, you know, it's not always this massive like red waving flag that like this person's autistic. Like, I think once you kind of, people kind of think that it only looks one certain way. So they're kind of, unless that person walks through the door, then they don't think that they're dealing with autistic employees or neurodivergent employees. And, you know, you are, whether you can see them or not, you are dealing with neurodivergent employees. And I think just kind of the best thing that I can do is just seeing me and hearing me talk about it and me sharing the way it shows up for me and the way in which it presents in me is just almost that like paradigm shift of, oh, so it's not just Sheldon Cooper, it might be somebody else. And I think that allows them to then, they're not looking through this kind of like wrong window anymore. They're looking at the whole workforce. But yeah, I think it is just reminding people that it's not just that one way. But I think it's, you know, I don't think it's anyone's fault. I think it's just a gradual process of educating people. You know, I wouldn't have known any different if I hadn't have come to this realization myself. So, you know, if I can help other people realize that too, then it's only helpful. And I think it's really like kind of important to remember as well that a lot of your neurodivergent employees won't even know that they're neurodivergent themselves. You know, a year ago, I didn't know. If someone would have said, you know, if anyone's autistic, can you like fill in this form so we can support you? I wouldn't have been ticking the box because I didn't know I was at that point. And I think if you can kind of encourage employers to support everyone, whether they're kind of aware, diagnosed, whatever, if you can just kind of spot something that someone's struggling with and support them in that and let them know the ways in which they can be supported, then you're kind of covering everybody. Everyone's going to benefit from that, not just the people who are lucky enough to have got to that diagnosis point.
I think what you said about like the Sheldon Coopers of the world is really, really interesting because so obviously I'm a therapist, but I work in schools like predominantly, and I see a lot of very, very well-intentioned staff, teachers, educators, TAs, whoever it is, who have that exact idea. And they might sort of see a boy lining cars up and they go, autism. And then they see a girl lining like Barbies up and they're like, oh, how gorgeous, she's so neat. And it really is like that they definitely do think they know, but they know a very, very, very tiny portion of actually what it is. So I think that's really like important to highlight because I think your experience of what you would have said as autistic as well is actually very similar to what a lot of people who are trained to work in the sector and work with autistic people also think. And I mean, that is changing now, but it is a slower than we would like change, I think. I was looking at, what was it? I think it was National Autistic Society. They do like a survey every year and they invite autistic people to respond. And there was a statistic, I think it was 7 out of 10 kids would be happier at school if their teachers understood autism more. And this is coming from autistic kids. And I just thought that's really that's really poignant and it's really heartbreaking, but it really, really shows sort of what we're dealing with, I think, here in the UK at the moment with our kind of understanding.
I think it's like a cycle as well, because obviously, like we were saying, the diagnostic criteria are set up to only pick out that certain kind of niche person. So they're the only people that know. So they're the only people that kind of come to the teachers and are, you know, we've got this autistic boy. You know, they don't get to know that I'm autistic because it never gets picked up in the first place. So I think it is this kind of like cycle that it's like, you know, it's like self-fulfilling. Well, these are the only people that are getting diagnosed, so these are the only people that we're aware of, so these are the only people that we know how to support. And it's like at some point that's got to break. Either, you know, the diagnostic criteria needed to change, the education needs to change. It's like until it's like that cycle just needs breaking off somewhere, because, you know, they're never going to know if the only people that they keep like getting told are autistic are the same people that are fitting those diagnostic criteria that are made to suit that type of person.
Yeah, totally. Sorry. I think that's why it's so refreshing and like wonderful for us to see someone like you who's now got such like a big presence, just being your authentic self and going, by the way, autism can also look like this. And having people actually like listen and take note, I think is just really, really like, it's really good to see.
Thank you.
So I would say as well, like obviously that all comes down to this whole thing of education, whether it's in a workplace, whether it's in a school setting, or any other kind of setting similar to that that's, you know, dealing with people essentially. Again, it comes down to this whole like misconception of autism and, like you say, the Sheldon Coopers of the world, etc. Obviously, this whole podcast is about talking about different stigmas and challenging different assumptions and just kind of educating, obviously, the wider audience of, you know, this is actually, there's more to this and this is how it can look in certain different ways in certain different people. In your experience, obviously you've touched on it a little bit already, just in terms of being a female and also being an adult. You've obviously seen and dealt with people who have different assumptions or misconceptions about autism, but what would you say the main kind of misconceptions are that you find, or kind of when people say something and you're like, that's not quite right, or that's a very outdated view? What is it? Is it normally just the same kinds of comments that you get?
I think so. I think there's kind of a lot of the like, oh, you don't look autistic or you don't seem autistic. And I'm like, well, what does autism look like? Because I am. So I think that's like definitely a big part. And I think it's almost like the people that are like, oh, like it's a bad thing. Like it's not, it doesn't need to be treated. It doesn't need to be cured. Like, oh, I'm so sorry. Or, you know, like, I don't know, like it's this kind of really bad thing that someone's got to live with. And it's like, I don't think there's nothing bad about being autistic. The struggles are in living in a world that's not meant for autistic people. So like I said, the reason I got to the low point wasn't being autistic. It was being in a place where everyone thought that I was rude when I wasn't being rude. You know, people didn't understand me. I didn't feel like I could connect to the people around me. I was getting overwhelmed with stuff. Like, it's not the actual, you know, if someone said like, we can cure your autism or you can not be autistic, or I wouldn't want that, because it's part of who I am. The struggles only come from the world not supporting that. And I think that's something for people to remember, like it's not this thing that we need to like treat or cure or like feel sympathy for. We just need to accommodate it better. Like, or we're not having a, you know, there's nothing wrong with us, we're just not supported. So instead of like trying to like feel sorry for me or, you know, cure me or come up with some treatment, you know, just help make the world a nicer place for me instead. I think that's, you know, the main thing to remember. And I think a lot of stuff is just like people don't understand what an autistic trait is. And I've seen this tweet and it was like, people say that they'd never bully someone for being autistic, but then they'll bully someone for being a fussy eater, being rude, being blunt, you know, getting overwhelmed, being a crybaby. And it's like, you can't, you know, people don't understand that all those things are actually traits of autism. Like, people just don't have the link of what actually is involved and what is, you know, people, it's just the lack of education in general, I think, really. I think so much of it is misunderstood to such a massive scale. But I think the most important thing for people to remember is just listen to us and support what we actually say we need, rather than thinking that you know, have this idea and it's a bad thing, and, you know, you have this understanding, which a lot of people just don't have.
Yeah, it is that kind of lack of awareness and, again, education. I saw your post, I think it might have been yesterday, about you trying to your access to work thing that you were doing with the government, and you were even like, the questions that they were asking me was just ridiculous. Like, they're not even, like, the government, like, they're not even aware of kind of, because what was one of the questions they asked was something like, how long has this been affecting you or your condition? And you were like, my whole life, it's my brain. Like, it's just
sorry, it's not funny. That's a terrible question.
Like, now I can look back and I can laugh, but yesterday I was so frustrated. I was like, it's not this poor girl on the phone's fault either. It's the whole, she's not been trained, and the people that have trained her haven't understood. And it's just like nobody, like, where does that start? At what point does that start? And I think for me, it can be quite frustrating as well, because it's like, I know that I am like making this difference and I'm helping people get their diagnosis. But in the grand scheme of things, that kind of makes things worse, because the more people are starting to have these realizations, the longer the waiting lists are, the more people need this support. And it's like the only, we can do as much changing at the bottom as we want, but until the people at the top actually step in and do something about it, then it's really hard. And, that just yesterday, it was the most frustrating thing in the whole world to, have waited such a long time for this support that is meant to be available to everybody. But then just how am I meant to be supported by someone that doesn't even understand me? You wouldn't ask somebody that question about, if someone was, I don't know, born with a physical disability that means that they've like never been able to walk or something. You wouldn't ask that question. So like, why do we not know that it's not okay to ask that question to somebody that's autistic? But yeah, I do get very like, certain stuff happens and I'm like, right, I need to take on the world right now. But yeah, I think slowly but surely we'll get to a point where people are more educated by it and do start to understand it more.
Yeah, it'll be good to see it kind of infiltrate up into like these big bodies like the government, and like, things that you need. And it's like, you're able to access this support, but they make it really difficult for you to do so. And it's almost like you have to do all this kind of like almost proving, and it's like, it's just a lot. So it would be so good, like in the future, this kind of, speaking about it in the awareness and acceptance and stuff can infiltrate all the way through to these bigger bodies, and it will just be so much more helpful, because I feel like it shouldn't be such a difficult process.
No, yeah, I think that's the thing that's frustrating as well. And I think what frustrates me is that I am obviously so vocal about it and I do kind of fight the good fight. But, I know that I've definitely been in places where I wouldn't have been able to do that. The only reason that 15-year-old mid-breakdown Ellie ever got any support was because my mum fought for me. And, my dad fought for me, and the people around me fought for me. But, some people, one, can't fight for themselves, and two, don't have those people around them to fight for them. So like, if me, the person that takes to LinkedIn every single day trying to kind of change these misconceptions, can't get the help, then what hope in hell has 15-year-old Ellie that couldn't speak and couldn't leave the house got? Because or the person that's in that situation now, what are they going to do if and I think that's what winds me up the most. It's like, I know that I'm very lucky that I've got this kind of energy and I've got the strength at the moment because of the people around me and because of the support that I have got the strength to fight for myself. But there's so many people out there that don't have that. And that's the whole point. Like, it's meant to be supporting them. Like, you can't claim to support somebody, but make them fight for that support. That's why they need the support, because they don't have the strength to fight.
Definitely. So back to the sort of unmasking topic, we said we would touch on it again. I saw a post of yours recently where you shared a message from your best friend, I think it was. And the whole message was all about masking and self-acceptance and being yourself. And you were saying how freeing it was to finally like let that mask down after all this time. Just first of all, how have you actually found your unmasking journey? Like, how has that been for you? And also, why was it so important for you now to then begin that journey of unmasking?
Yeah, I think I very quickly realized that the reason for like the anxiety and the exhaustion and the depression that I felt was just this constant act of pretending. And I think that's so... people don't really understand masking. They're kind of like, oh yeah, you like forced eye contact, or you like tried to make yourself normal. And it's like, no, I literally used probably double the amount of energy a day that I use now, because I was like acting as this person. I was, double thinking, considering what people are thinking, trying to navigate this world that I don't understand and doesn't understand me. And that is exhausting. And I think, that is something as well that like I wish people understood more that about, people are kind of like, oh, well, everyone masks, you know, everyone like puts themselves, you know, puts on a brave face or covers stuff up. And I'm like, that shouldn't be the case. Like, it is so exhausting. So I think for me, once I finally got that answer and I started to kind of, everything started to click into place, it was just like this relief that I could finally stop pretending. I do think it's amazing, but it's not easy. You know, I think, again, it was like kind of what I touched on earlier, like it's the digging around in your whole life and working out, right, what if that was me? What if that was pretending, you know? Who am I? If I'm not the mask, who actually am I underneath? So I think that's a big thing. And I think it's kind of something that was really tricky for me after my diagnosis, was kind of realizing that all the friendships I've had or relationships I've had or whatever, people that have loved me or liked me or cared about me, they all loved a fake version of me. And that's not their fault, because that was the only one that they were presented with. But I think that was something that took me a while to get my head around. And it was like, you know, almost that grief for all of these like fake connections. But not even kind of on both sides, because it's not like I hate, you know, I'm annoyed at that person for not loving the real me because they didn't get the chance to. And it's almost like sad on their side as well that they didn't get the real me in that friendship or whatever. But I think, it's definitely like the first phase is definitely like, for me, a lot of kind of relief of like, we can stop pretending now, like it's okay to just be yourself. And I think it was kind of realizing that, I was never a bad person. I was just a different person, you know, kind of all this time that I'd spent like, you know, why am I saying one thing, but people seem to take it in a completely different way. You know, I think I'm being nice. I think I'm being a good friend. I think I'm doing the right thing, but everyone around me thinks that I'm this annoying, you know, bitch. Like, why? So I think that was like the first bit of relief, like, oh my God, okay, you're not a bad person. You're just different. That's like the huge part of it. But then I think there's almost like two phases of it, I guess. There's that first bit of relief of like, okay, I'm just going to be myself now. But then it's kind of like, I guess analysing a lot of like how much of it is a mask and how much of it, and if the mask is gone, what's under there as well. You know, I've been reading a book recently called Unmasking Autism by Dr. Devon Price. And he says, he's like, because we all have this like internalized ableism, this idea of the kind of specific idea of autism that we've been like fed, of this like really awkward, annoying man, it's almost a bit scary that it's like, well, what if I do drop the mask, and what if I am that annoying, difficult to be around person underneath? Like, what if that's what I'm actually like? So it's definitely like a process to go through. But I think, you know, the sooner that we can, it kind of all ties into each other, the more that we can educate people that being autistic is not a bad thing, and it doesn't mean that you're annoying, and it doesn't mean this, and it doesn't mean that, then the easier it is for people to unmask, because there's not like the risk of being disliked when you do unmask. But it's definitely something that kind of, I'm quite like, I'm very, I'd say, obsessed with it at the moment, because it's kind of like literally going through so many things and being like, okay, do I actually like this? You know, how do I actually feel about this? Do I actually enjoy doing this thing? Do I actually enjoy being this person or acting this way, or, you know, taking part in this activity? And it's quite nice to get to like almost rediscover life and myself, you know, as it happens. You know, stuff comes up and it's like, so this weekend I went to a festival for the first time since I've been diagnosed. And it's like, okay, what does that look like for me now? Do I still feel comfortable going to the front? Do I want to stand at the back? You know, do I want to dance? Do I want to not? Do I feel comfortable with people touching me? Do I want to be a bit further away? Like, every single thing is kind of like, okay, how do I actually enjoy this thing in a way that feels right for me, not in the way that I felt like I had to pretend when I didn't have all the answers. So I think it's definitely an ongoing thing, but overall it's the best thing that could have happened.
That's really, really eye-opening for me to listen to you talk about that, in terms of your relationships with people as well. This is quite a personal question. Please don't answer it if you don't want to answer it. But just sort of out of my own interest, do you still have relationships with some people who you had relationships with pre-diagnosis? And if you are, how, you know, have they changed? Have your friends kind of got it? Have you found yourself trying to have to like explain all this stuff a lot? Like how are you navigating those?
I would say like a lot of people that are in my life now are new people in my life. And I think that's because, one, I never really, like, I've always really struggled with friends. So it's kind of like a lot of the friends that I had, well, I didn't have that many to start off with. So it's not like I've kind of like dumped hundreds of friends to start this new life. Kind of, I really didn't have many friends because I was so kind of unsure of who I was, and I'd had such a hard time. Like I'd dropped out of school, I'd left different work, but I'd never really found my place. And I think a lot of the friends, or like maybe like more acquaintances that I'd had, are brilliant people, and I still, keep in contact with, but I just realized that I didn't have much in common with them. The person that I had been to be friends with them wasn't really, what I actually am like now. I do a lot of different, I guess, but yeah, before I was kind of like, I don't know, went through a stage of being like going out every weekend and wanting to like go to bars and dance and all this stuff. And it's like, I actually quite enjoy my own company on a weekend now.
Yeah.
So I think like my interests have changed. So that has led to like different friendships.
Yeah.
But I think the people that I have stayed friends with, like kind of like my best friend Alex, like obviously like family, and there is other friends that have kind of made the journey, and I think it is just them just feeling happy that I can finally be happy. And I think it's nice, like the message that you mentioned from the post, that was from Alex, my best friend. I think from her point of view, it's just like, it's so nice to see you happy, because she's been there through the leaving jobs, they're being so unhappy, they're being so confused, they're being so overwhelmed, and now it's kind of like, for her, it's just very nice to see me happy. But I think there's a lot, if you are a friend of somebody going through that process, I can imagine it being quite difficult, because I am a completely different person to the person that I was a year ago in all aspects of life. And I think that's kind of like gradually, like my ex-partner who I was with at the time of the counsellor kind of saying there, has it ever been looked into? I guess that's probably why we drifted apart. There was no kind of like big thing that happened that in the relationship for it to end. It was kind of just like, okay, the person that you started dating isn't actually me. Like, you really liked that person, but that's not actually, some of it is obviously me. Like, the underlying person is still me, but I don't have the same hobbies as that person. I don't have the same interests as that person. I don't like doing the same things as that person. And that's the person that you had those stuff in common with. So I think like that was a really kind of hard thing to go through. But I think like, especially now, there's like kind of like no hard feelings of it. It is just kind of part of the process. But yeah, I think even, especially my family have kind of noticed that there's a massive, massive change in me. But I think, the friendships and the relationships and stuff that I'm building now are so much more like actual friendships than what I've had in the past. I think, because, from my point of view, I am actually being myself, but from their point of view, they're getting a legitimate human rather than this kind of people pleaser that's a bit like unsure of what's going on. But yeah, I do think it'd have to be a strong relationship to make it through that process, because it is almost like having a new friend or a new partner, or, I always kind of think about, for my mum and dad especially, like they've had a daughter for 24 years and now they've got an autistic daughter. And it's again, like I've obsessed over like understanding and learning and finding out as much as I can about autism, but they don't, it's either on them to do that, but no one does it. The doctors don't sit down with them and say, like they would have done if I was 3 or 4, they would have had support groups. They would have been there through all my therapy. They would have had family counselling. Like, that doesn't happen now. It's just kind of up to them. And I guess it can be quite strange for them for like stuff that I'm now not okay with. And it's like, well, you've always been fine with that, and it's like, well, yeah, because I was masking. And I think, I'm really lucky that my family are so amazing and supportive, and they're doing that education and they're learning and they're listening to me. But I can imagine that being really hard to navigate, because you've, suddenly somebody who's been one way is completely setting new boundaries, acting in new ways, like behaving in different ways. And it's suddenly like, I guess that can be quite difficult to understand when you're not the person going through it.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting way to think about it as well, is that, it's more than just that one person who's receiving the diagnosis, isn't it? It's the, if it's a younger person, like it's their parents as well, and it's the sort of support and guidance that they may need moving forward. And I'm sure, Laura, you're more sort of an expert in that sort of stuff, because I think you obviously speak to parents and you speak to families of autistic people. And would you say it's the kind of same thing with like parents kind of needing some kind of support moving forward, and just things about how do we navigate this now moving forward with our child who's got this diagnosis now, and how we kind of do our next steps?
Yeah, so I think it really depends on, the family and the person, how old the person is when they get the diagnosis, and how, aware families are of different diagnoses, and how aware they are that their child is probably neurodivergent. So it really, really depends on the actual family, but there's definitely always, I'd say maybe like an adjustment period for parents, especially because, like you were saying, Ellie, parents have a child for however many years, and then suddenly they have an autistic child. And where a lot of parents are, of the older generation and don't necessarily have the understanding that we have of autism now, a lot of the time they do think, okay, so my child's going to grow up to be Sheldon Cooper or Albert Einstein. And what am I going to do to help them and support them? And what therapy shall I throw at them? And we have to get them into SALT, we have to get them into OT, and they're going to need physiotherapy. And actually a lot of what we as professionals have a duty to do is kind of educate parents and say, actually, they are still your child. They are your child that you have always known and always loved. And they might have, different needs that you need to be aware of in order to support them to function in a neurotypical world. But there's nothing wrong with your child. They don't necessarily need SALT. They don't necessarily need OT. They only need these things if they have, an area of difficulty within that sort of sector or within that area of functioning. So I think for professionals, we have a bit of a duty to kind of navigate that change in mindset with parents a lot, and try and support them through that, the best that we can, and try and meet them where they're at with it as well, because some parents are a lot more ready to hear that than other parents are. So yeah, it can be a tricky thing for parents to understand, but it can also be a really empowering thing for parents to understand, depending on where they are at that stage when their child gets diagnosis.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I think with Magic Words, one of the things that we like to sort of aim for on our social media channels is a lot of our content kind of is aimed at parents, or those kinds of either like teachers or professionals in that sense, people that are dealing with the same kind of clients or children or adults that we are, and it's all about sort of education and are you seeing this? Like, what does this mean? And it's just like another, we want to basically just be another source of education. So if you have any questions, and similar like what you were saying earlier, Ellie, like before you kind of had your diagnosis and you were doing research, you were looking at things like TikTok and you were looking at things on things like Instagram, things like that. We kind of are trying to be that space where it's like, here is actually a fountain of knowledge. And if you have any kind of concerns as a parent, you can come on and you can have a look and we can give you some sort of professional advice in that sense. And one of the things that we've been doing recently is like a series of do's and don'ts. And this kind of goes all over. So more than just autism, but we've done one recently, which was do's and don'ts of when talking to someone who stammers. So it was all things like, don't talk over the person, don't finish their sentence, things like that. But also, here's something you can do. So it's like remaining eye contact, etc., etc. In terms of do's and don'ts, like, do you have any do's and don'ts for neurotypical people when it comes to communicating with an autistic person? Like, in your experience, is there things that you're like, God, do not say that, or it would be really helpful if you did X, Y, Z?
Yeah, I think in terms of like helpful things, it's helpful to be as clear as possible. Like not great at reading between the lines. Like clarity to me is one of the most important things in like all of my kind of like friendships, relationships, working relationships, anything. It's kind of like just say what you mean and mean what you say. And I think if you can kind of remember that, and sometimes I think to a lot of people, to friends and like people that I've known, it's kind of like, I shouldn't have to say that. And it's like, but I need you to. So I think if you can just remember that, like say what you mean what you say. And yeah, the other, like the mean what you say part as well. Like something my parents always kind of like joke about is that they couldn't ever mention the word McDonald's, because if they'd said it, then it was like, I would never drop that forever. And I think, I was like, well, you said that we were going to McDonald's. So, and I think, people say stuff all the time in passing conversation. But I think just trying to be really careful with the words that you use in terms of, one, being clear, but two, not saying something if it's a bit uncertain or you don't mean it, or making it clear that it is uncertain. But yeah, just that clarity, I think, is something that's really important. I think kind of drop your like neurotypical expectations. I think, people might, the stuff that we've been taught about like good communication and about how people should act, just it's like very ableist towards autistic people. It's like, look me in the eye when you're talking to me. Well, that makes me feel really uncomfortable. So, but as well, like as somebody from the outside, like don't think that just because I'm not looking in your eyes that I'm being rude or that I'm not listening to you. Or don't think that because I'm talking quite monotone and quite straight to the point that I'm being blunt or rude. I think just as much as I need you to make everything as clear to me, like please take me at face value without any of those kind of ideas of what it should be like. So yeah, I think don't confuse my lack of eye contact for not listening. Don't think that, don't add in context that's not there. I think, people might often think that like, oh, she's not texted me for a few days, so she must be annoyed at me or she must be this. And it's probably like, I'm just not able to communicate right now. Or I think, yeah, just kind of the main thing is, I think, just like drop those misconceptions or those preconceptions of like what a friendship should look like or what a conversation should look like, and just take it very much at face value. I think do listen to what that specific person thinks. I think, like we've kind of mentioned all the way through this chat, like we're all still learning about what it means to be autistic. So the person that is asking for the accommodations or is asking you to behave in a certain way or is asking for a certain thing from you, like trust that from them rather than thinking that you know best. People might think that, oh, Ellie's autistic, so she won't like this social situation, so we'll just leave her to do her own thing. But, I'd be quite upset if I was left out of something, so because you think that that when not sociable, you would kind of act in a way that you were trying to be helpful, but wasn't. So I think just take each person's kind of own lived experience and own kind of what they want and what they need as being the right thing to do. I think that's kind of the main things.
So that actually leads us on to our last question, which is obviously with Magic Words, we have our Empower Autism service. So we provide specialist speech and language therapy and counselling for autistic people and their families. And we do that in many different settings. So Ellie, in your experience then, in a sort of targeted at therapists and clinicians and professionals, what would you want them to know from your kind of experience really about autism, and what is it, those things that you think, actually, if I'm going to speak to a clinician or a therapist one-on-one, is there anything that you'd want to be like, I just want to highlight this or this?
Yeah, I think it's quite tricky, and I think it's something that like I've been looking out for a lot at the moment. I knew after my diagnosis that I needed to speak to somebody, I needed some sort of counselling, but then I was kind of like, it's counterproductive if I then just go to kind of like a standard counsellor, because then they might not have that knowledge of, and I'm having to contextualise every single thing. But I think, yeah, just if people can have, again, that understanding and educate themselves as much as they possibly can. But I think just again, the eye contact thing, the safe space, like if I feel like it's, or kind of asking for people's favorite way to communicate, like people might not want an in-person session, they might want the phone, they might want to text, they might want a Skype call. I think, ask people what's best for them. I think, just again, I think similar to the conversation things, like if I take your question or if I kind of respond in a way that might appear blunt, like I'm not being rude, I just either don't understand the question or don't feel comfortable to answer it. So I think being kind of clear and gentle is very important. And I think, probably like letting people ease into it. I think, especially at the start, I think, everybody feels uncomfortable the first time that they go to therapy because it's something new. But I think especially someone autistic, it's a new environment, it's a new person, it's something that I don't know, I can't be in control of it, because that's the whole point, that I'm like going somewhere where I'm not sure where I'm going to go. That can be quite uncomfortable. So I think, letting people come round and like get into it, the conversation, and into the kind of therapy at their own pace is quite important. And I think in terms of that, if you can support somebody in terms of like giving them as much information as possible, so like the directions of where to go, like make it really clear what time you're going to phone them, or where they can park their car, and how far it's going to take them to walk from the train station. I think that can be really helpful, because it gets rid of that anxiety beforehand. It kind of would make me feel more comfortable once I got there, if I hadn't gone through that whole stress beforehand of like the uncertainty. If as much, like therapy itself is uncertain, that's the point, but if as much of the stuff around it can have that structure and clarity and certainty, then it makes that one part of uncertainty a bit less overwhelming, I think.
I think we should talk about it. Diving deep, let it go, see you want it.
Thank you so much, Ellie. This has been like a really, really, really good chat. Even just for me as a professional, it's been really wonderful to talk to you. And I want to thank you for being so like open and candid and honest with us. I just think it's been really great. So thank you.
Yeah,
thank you so much for having me. It's been really nice to chat as well. I think it's some kind of conversations that's so important to have, but can feel uncomfortable. So I think it's nice to, one, for me to have them and be able to kind of talk about those things that I might not get a chance to talk about. But two, like to do it in a way that it might help other people that can listen to it as well.
I think we should talk about it. Diving deep,